Almost a year to the day after his company unleashed environmental Armageddon on the Gulf of Mexico, BP's Swedish chairman has given a remarkable interview reflecting on the disaster. His reaction 1 year later, quote, halting deepwater drilling doesn't feel like a logical conclusion to this. 50,000 holes have been drilled in the Gulf of Mexico, and this was the first time things went this wrong. I mean, if you do anything 50,000 times, you're bound to screw up once, right? Who's with me? More from the BP chairman, quote, it is a burdensome road to regain the trust of the American people. The U.S. is one of the countries that reacts the loudest when something happens. The chairman of BP seems remarkably unfazed by what his company wrought in the Gulf just a year ago. This may be the reason why. These are BP's profits. That's $4.3 billion in the last quarter of 2009, all the way up to $5.6 billion in the last quarter of 2010. That thing right there in the middle, that's just one of their holes in the Gulf of Mexico that had a little bit of a problem. No big deal. BP has been doing great since the big Gulf disaster. Thank you very much. So much so that they are now trying to get back in. They have a new permit to drill pending before U.S. regulators right now. They have been busy buying stakes in other Gulf oil fields in the meantime. BP, of course, is just one of three companies that were involved in that catastrophic spill last year. How are the other two companies doing? Also pretty great. Transocean, who operated the rig that blew up and sank last year, they are already back in business in the Gulf. Of the first 10 post-BP deepwater drilling permits granted by the government, 4 of the 10 will be drilled by Transocean rigs. Almost half of the new post-BP disaster wells will be drilled by the same guys whose rig blew up and caused the BP disaster less than a year ago. The third company involved in all this was Halliburton. They cemented the well. That did not hold. That blew up. That killed 11 men. That spewed for months into the Gulf. How's Halliburton done since then? Pretty great. In the year since their failed cement job led to that blowout, Halliburton's profits have more than doubled. In the first quarter last year, before the blowout, they banked $206 million profit. The first quarter of this year, $511 million profit. And like Transocean, they are right back at work in the Gulf. The company's chief exec is now bragging they have won 30% of the drilling service contracts and 40% of the well work contracts for the permits that have been handed out by the government so far. Tomorrow, April 20th, marks 1 year since the big BP Transocean Halliburton oil disaster. And a year out from that disaster, which was specifically the fault of those three companies, it's really full speed ahead for all of them. And it's not just those three companies. It's really full speed ahead for the entire oil industry. Heading into today, the federal government had granted 10 new post-BP permits to deepwater drill in the Gulf of Mexico. And they did that even though they are still not done figuring out what went wrong in the BP disaster. The investigation is not complete. The results we have thus far indicate that the crucial piece of safety equipment known as the blowout preventer does not work. And yet, the federal government is handing out new permits anyway, while they acknowledge publicly that they haven't quite figured it all out yet, and they're pretty sure new safety rules are necessary.
More change will surely come, although not at the frantic pace of the past year. It will address weaknesses and necessary improvements to blowout preventers, as well as many other issues.
That was the top oil regulator in the country, Michael Bromwich, saying in a speech today that more rules are needed, more rules are coming, but later. Why later? In part so the government can consult with the oil industry, he says, to make sure they are comfortable with all of these new rules. A year out from the BP disaster, not only are permits going out again before the new safety rules are in place, but the regulators in charge of the permitting are bending over backwards to talk about how much these new rules will be guided by the industry, how much the oil industry will be consulted on all this. We don't want to make them do anything they don't want to do. Mr. Bromwich cited by name today the newly formed Center for Offshore Safety. He said the Center for Offshore Safety will provide the basis for new regulations going forward. Who is this Center for Offshore Safety? Is this some disinterested group of experts? Actually, the opposite. It is a project of the American Petroleum Institute, the industry's trade group. So the industry will tell the government which rules they think should be in place and which rules should not, because clearly they know what they're doing. The role of the government when it comes to regulation is not to make sure the industry gets its needs met. It is not to make sure all the new rules are cool with them. The oil industry is not some struggling industry. Even after the BP disaster, BP is still the 4th most profitable company in the world right now. The role of the government here, the role of government regulators here is to take care of us, Not to take care of them, to protect us humans from what the industry is doing in order to make all of its obscene profit. Right now, a year out from the BP disaster, the regulators are very, very well attuned to the industry's sensitivities. But what about ours? The government was super excited to announce the first 10 permits that they gave out since the BP disaster. It seemed like they thought everybody would be psyched about that. But what those announcements turned into was people looking really closely at those new permits and being sort of ooged out by what they found. Oil spill response plans that date from before the BP oil disaster? Really? All of that digging led to a raft of negative press coverage that seemed to catch the permitting agency completely off guard. I'm sure the oil industry had told them how delighted everybody would be by these new drilling permits. Quel horror that there are interests here other than the industry's. The government seemed to not be prepared for that. After a less than glowing reaction to the first 10 permits, this drilling permits agency, who again is there to protect us, the public, the Gulf, they say they will no longer announce to us, the public, when they hand out any more new permits. No more press releases. No more public chest beating about how proud they are to be issuing permits again. No more nothing. Today, through all sorts of sleuthing on their website, we were able to find there that they have now approved an 11th new permit to drill in the Gulf of Mexico, this one to Shell Oil. You really have to dig and snoop around in order to find it, but it is there. There will be no more public announcements about new drilling post-BP. But you know what? There's already 50,000 holes in the Gulf of Mexico, so who's really going to care about one more?